Right, well, welcome to our session today. I'm Ann Johans, and I'm an Extension Program Specialist with Iowa State University, and I get to serve as the moderator for this series. It's a three-part series that's part of a grant funded from the North Central Extension Risk Management Education Center and supported by the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and so that's how we're able to bring this webinar series to you. And the goal of the project is to focus on core components for better marketing as well as strategies to expand marketing knowledge for cattle producers. We were talking about yesterday, the prices are great, but there is a cycle and things don't stay that way. And so it's so important to be aware of all the things that go into your cost of production and your marketing and having a better understanding of the product that you have, right? So today we are talking about yield and quality grade, which is really that carcass evaluation and then marketing on a grid. And so we have Chris Clark, who is one of our extension beef specialists. And I'm grateful to have you here with us today, Chris. I think I will be learning a lot through this session. And so if you want to go ahead and share your screen, we can get started. And as he's doing that, I can also share if you are interested in digging in more, there are in-person sessions for this happening. There was one last night, but I bet you could join for the two second and third parts of that in-person session that's up in Decorah. And then there is an in-person session starting in Mount Ayr on April 29th. That's a three-part series again. And then they're going to combine it all into a one-day session in Guthrie Center on May 31st, if you wanted to get it all at once, to have some discussions with other folks in person, right, on these topics and learn from the specialists as well as those in the audience who are experts themselves. So with that, I'm going to jump off and let Chris get started.
All right. So thank you, Ann, very much. Ann, you'll have to let me know if you can see my slides okay.
It looks great. Yes.
Good. Great. Thank you very much, Ann, for your support. I know the technology part of this is challenging for me, so I sure appreciate the help. Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. We're going to talk today just a little bit about carcass evaluation and marketing on a grid. So like Ann said, my name is Chris Clark, and I am a veterinarian by schooling. I work full-time for Iowa State as an extension beef specialist, and have been doing that for over 12 years now. And want to share just a little bit about, how we evaluate carcasses and how to kind of think through your carcass data and your carcass results, and then how you might go about marketing on a grid or what it means to market on a grid. And so as we start this discussion, I'd like you to think just a little bit about how do you market your cattle and why do you market them the way that you do? And as you're thinking about that, I'm going to go through here just a few factors that I think are important in influencing producers and how they market. And so if we think about retaining ownership in any way, whether that be finishing the cattle ourselves or sending them to a custom feed yard, we've got to think about feed costs. A lot of times we focus on the price of corn as the major commodity used in the diets. But there certainly are other feed ingredients that we need to think about. We need to think about the value of those cattle as feeder calves versus their potential value as fed cattle. And that kind of
Whoops,
more
Chris?
time.
Oh, your sound came back. Your sound popped out there for just a minute. So if you want to just step back about a sentence.
Okay. So as you're thinking about how you market cattle, we want to think about kind of the factors that influence those decisions. And when we think about retained ownership, whether that be in our own lots or in a custom feed yard, we need to think about feed costs and value as feeder calves versus potential value as fed cattle. And that kind of comes into weighing risk versus reward. So what's the potential risk and potential reward for retaining ownership and investing more time and more dollars, more feed into those cattle? If you're going to finish the cattle yourself, we need to think about facilities, lot space, bunk space, processing facilities, and those types of things. Feed availability comes into play. labor comes into play. And then we might even think about our knowledge and skills. Do we have the knowledge and the skills to do a good job of feeding cattle to finish? When it comes to custom feeding as an option, a lot of times it comes down to that familiarity with the process and maybe whether we have some comfort or some trust with the managers of a feed yard. We also have to think about cost there. So what are they charging for yardage, feed markup, chute fees, processing fees, and those types of things. And then if we think about selling on a grid, this may be the most important set of factors here, and that would include the quality of the cattle. And so what's the carcass merit of our cattle, marbling potential, cutability, red meat yield, what's their expected performance, and even things like health. How likely are they to require health treatment in the feed yard? And so I think the place to start here is to really just talk about how carcasses are evaluated. Some of this will be pretty basic. I tend to maybe oversimplify some of it. But when we start talking about selling on a grid, we start talking about yield grade, quality grade, choice select spread, those types of things. I think it's important just to step back and make sure we all understand exactly what we're talking about. So to me, I often start with just talking about two general kinds of body fat, okay? Or two kinds of fat on a carcass. So the first would be general body fat, sometimes called back fat, cover fat, just cover. That's going to be estimated by measuring the fat thickness over the 12th rib. And generally speaking, excessive general body fat is a bad thing. So when we sell beef carcasses, we kind of like to focus on production of the saleable product, which is that red meat. Excessive cover fat tends to kind of hurt with just overall efficiency, tends to be more product that just needs to be trimmed away. Marbling then is the intramuscular fat. That's going to be estimated by determining the amount of the white fat tissue within the ribeye muscle. And generally speaking, the more marbling, the better. So marbling is associated with a better eating experience. With good marbling, the meat tends to be more tender, more juicy, more flavorful. And so the more of that, the better. As some of you well know, it's kind of a tricky game sometimes to try to get as much marbling as possible while getting as little cover fat as possible. They're not perfectly aligned, but the two tend to increase together as we increase days on feed and degree of finish. So when we talk about grading carcasses, there are several measurements that are taken and used to calculate the yield grade. And then the ribeye is evaluated for that marbling content, which is used to determine the quality grade. And we'll talk about both yield and quality grade coming up here. Yield grade describes the percent of carcass weight in what they call the boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts from the round loin, rib, and chuck. Now, to me, that definition takes a little thought to really have it make sense. And so I like to kind of simplify it, kind of step back a little bit. Basically, the yield grade kind of compares the amount of muscle to the amount of fat in a carcass. Essentially kind of is a ratio of muscle to fat or vice versa, of fat to muscle. There are 4 factors that are used to determine the yield grade, and that would be hot carcass weight, ribeye area, fat cover at the 12th rib, and then what they call KPH, which is kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. So we've got just a few pictures here kind of trying to demonstrate those 4 factors and getting measurements of those factors. So this is just a set of carcasses hanging on a rail, trying to kind of represent here getting the hot carcass weight. And what they'll do is after the head, the feet, the hide has been removed, before the carcass is chilled, they'll just weigh it. And so that's our hot carcass weight. This next picture here represents measuring the ribeye area. Now, these days, this is done mostly with digital cameras. This is showing kind of the old-fashioned manual way of doing it. This is how I would do it if I was going into a locker to maybe measure some carcasses for a 4-H locker contest or something like that. It's a plastic see-through grid, and it's got a bunch of dots on it, and it's calibrated so that basically every dot represents 1/10 of a square inch. So you simply lay that over the ribeye, count the dots that are overlaying red muscle tissue, and then you do the math, move the decimal point, and you get your measurement of the ribeye in square inches. This kind of shows just measuring that back fat. So typically we're going to measure, see if I can get my cursor pulled up here. We're going to measure the back fat thickness at about 3/4 the length of the ribeye, as measured kind of moving away from the backbone. So there's different ways to do that. You can use like a stainless steel ruler. There's different calipers that you can use. Sometimes the plastic grid that we use to get ribeye area will have a ruler kind of marked on the edge, so you can just use that same instrument. The picture to the right here is just kind of marking the outline of a ribeye. So again, we're focused on measuring the ribeye area just over this red muscle tissue and focused on the longissimus muscle, and then kind of showing here where we would measure that back fat thickness. So these pictures are maybe a little less intuitive here, but they're supposed to be demonstrating kind of a difference in kph between two carcasses. So with kph, it's measured as a percentage of hot carcass weight. Typically, it's going to run like 1 to 4%, somewhere in there. And it's done kind of subjectively. You simply step back and analyze how much fat tissue do you see in the pelvic area, around the kidneys, and then around the heart if the heart is still hanging with the carcass. So in these pictures, hopefully, if you look closely, you can appreciate that in the pelvic area of this carcass on your left, there's not as much fat tissue as in this carcass on the right. So there's a lot of white fat tissue kind of accumulated right up in here, where this looks pretty empty over in the left-hand carcass. We make the same comparison around the kidneys. So around this kidney area, there's not a tremendous amount of fat. In this carcass, we can see a nice clump of dense white fat tissue over here around the kidneys of this carcass. So carcass on the left is probably closer to 1% kph, or on the right, we're probably looking at more like 3 to 4%. So you can kind of hopefully see that difference. So they do a calculated yield grade by plugging the measurements from those 4 factors into this equation. It gives you a number then that ranges from 1 to 5. And actually, it can go above 5 if you include the decimal places. But I think Ann tried to put together a little poll question for you here. So I'd like to ask, what is better, a higher or lower yield grade number?
Okay, I've released the poll. So
Okay.
folks who are on a tablet might see it. I know if they're on a computer, they will, but just, yeah, you get to pick between higher or lower.
So while you're answering that and maybe trying to find the poll question on your device, take a look at that equation. You'll notice that there's a plus sign in front of the 3 factors that are associated with greater degree of finish or more fat cover. And then there's a negative sign in front of the ribeye area factor, which is associated with more muscle. So that's a bit of a clue if you're thinking about which is better.
Oh, we're going to close my poll, and I got about half. The answers came in half and half.
Okay. Okay. So if we think about that definition of yield grade again, so it tells us the percentage of weight from the closely trimmed, or percentage of mass from the closely trimmed boneless cuts of, those major cuts of beef. Um, Essentially, a lower number is going to be better because it's going to represent more muscle, which is our product, and less fat, which tends to be our waste, okay, in terms of that cover fat. So I'm going to explain that a little more as we move forward here. Essentially, when we think about yield grade, if the carcass has more muscle and or less fat, it's going to have a lower yield grade number, and that's considered a positive thing. If the carcass has more fat and or less muscle, it's going to have a higher yield grade number, and that's considered a negative. So I'd like to talk about these two calves here. I know you've got three pictures. The two pictures on your left are of the same calf, looking at just a hind view and then a profile view. These two calves are quite different in terms of their phenotype. The calf on the left is from the Iowa State Fair Beef of Merit Carcass Contest. And he's a pretty powerful calf just in terms of a big hind quarter, a big top, a large ribeye. A little tough to see just from still pictures like this, but he's pretty lean. You can see on his profile picture here kind of a bit of muscle kind of even showing through the skin down in that right hind quarter of his. Doesn't seem to have a lot of fat over the tail head. The calf on the right would be a typical Angus type feedlot calf. Looks to be smaller framed, lighter, flatter muscled, and carrying more fat cover, right? He's certainly putting down some fat around the tail head. Can't see the brisket well, but I would imagine there's some fat accumulation down in the brisket. He looks nice and rounded and smooth here over the loin and the ribs. To me, it's pretty clear that the calf on the right would have a higher yield grade number as opposed to the calf on the left. So this is a picture that I found years ago on the Certified Angus Beef website. I think it's a really nice picture for demonstrating kind of some differences between different yield grades and stuff like that. Some really good talking points here when you look at this picture of a yield grade 3 side by side compared to a yield grade 5. So we're going to try this. I'm going to open it up and ask you, what differences or similarities do you notice between these two ribeyes? And if you'd like to type your answers into the chat, we're going to let Ann kind of moderate that. I'll give you maybe just a minute or so, and then maybe Ann can read out some of the responses.
Yeah, so I didn't share, if you want to type into the chat, it's probably along the bottom on your computer and it might be along the top if you are on a tablet. And I have a few coming in. You can choose, I think, just the panelists so that we can see those answers. And so, yep, I'm getting a few that, so 3, there's less marbling. So they're seeing that there's a difference in the muscle between the two, and less fat, yep, more red meat on the left side. That yield grade 3, it's showing up here, right, is more desirable.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's an excellent job. You guys noticed some of the big differences right away. So I'm going to hold off on talking about the marbling for right now, and we're going to focus on the ribeye area and the fat cover thickness. So to me, when I look at these differences, the yield grade 3, which is the one on your left, simply has a bigger ribeye, right? It's a larger longissimus muscle. There's more red meat there. It also has less cover fat as opposed to the carcass on the right. Okay, so in both of those ways, it promotes a lower yield grade number as opposed to the carcass on the right. Over here, we've got a smaller longissimus muscle, a smaller ribeye area, and more fat cover thickness. Okay, so in both of those ways, this one is going to be pushed toward a higher yield grade number. Like I said, we'll come back to the marbling in just a moment. So in addition to that yield grade analysis, we also look at quality grade of our cattle. Upon slaughter, they're going to be graded as prime, choice, select, or standard. Those are the 4 general categories. We often talk about there being like 10 different categories of quality grade. Some of these are kind of broken down into subcategories. Prime, for instance, you'll sometimes see described as upper and lower prime. Often that's not all that important because prime premiums will kick in as soon as you hit low prime, and all the primes are kind of rewarded the same way on most grids. Choice is the category that is definitely broken down into subcategories. And there they'll talk about low choice, average choice, and high choice. And those differ based on the degree of marbling. Subjectively, we describe those marbling levels as small, modest, and moderate. So low choice carcasses would have a small amount of marbling. Average choice carcasses would have a modest amount of marbling, and upper choice would have a moderate amount. And then we go down to select. Again, select is sometimes described as upper and lower select. Often the selects are all kind of priced the same way. But they would have slight marbling. And then if we get down to standard, we're talking about just traces, or maybe even the carcass being practically devoid of marbling. Standards get discounted pretty aggressively because they are associated with a lesser eating experience. So this is a nice chart from the USDA that shows the relationship between marbling, maturity, and carcass quality grade. So we're going to keep this simple and just focus on maturity A. So these would be cattle that are less than 30 months of age. Excuse me. And so we just have to focus on this column right here. Again, those 4 categories that I described are listed here, associated with descriptions of degrees of marbling, which are down this left column. And so once we get to abundant, so slightly abundant or more, that's going to be considered prime. Here we've got our 3 levels of choice, so moderate, modest, and small. And then we've got select as slight marbling, and then standard as just traces or practically devoid of marbling. So these are examples of the USDA standard pictures that they use. Just a visual comparison so that we can see what each quality grade is supposed to look like. And they make official grading cards that you can buy from like NCBA that are laminated cards that have these pictures. The real thing shows up a little bit better than these digital versions of the picture sometimes, but hopefully you can appreciate that as we move to the left from here, and then as we go down and move to the right from here, and then as we move down and move to the right from here, the marbling content just gets lesser and lesser. So these 2 here, the moderately abundant and the slightly abundant, those would represent primes. This moderate would be an upper choice. The modest is an average choice. And then we've got small as low choice. And then we've got slight as select. Now, back to this picture. Some people commented, I think, on the marbling difference. So there's no question that we've got a difference here in marbling content. The yield grade 3 on your left is a well marbled piece of meat, probably like average choice or so. It's hard to say without the comparison card right there next to it, but I think certainly would hit low choice. And then on your right, this is a very well marbled ribeye here, and actually with pretty widespread distribution of that marbling with tiny little flecks of intramuscular fat. And that tends to be kind of a good distribution as compared to, maybe bigger chunks of fat that are less widely dispersed. So the texture of that marbling is really good too. So sometimes if I'm doing these meetings in person, I will ask, well, which one do you choose? Which one would you rather take home and grill tonight? Or which one would you rather purchase at a restaurant? There's a lot of give and take here. Some people are going to pick this because of a larger serving size and because it's perfectly acceptable. Some people are going to say this looks like a really, high quality piece of meat and a really good eating experience. So not really a right or a wrong answer there. I'm not really familiar with all the ins and outs of using digital cameras to do grading, but I found this picture and I've always liked it because it brings up a few good talking points for education. So basically here, if we focus on the left-hand ribeye, you've got kind of a natural looking picture, and then to the right of it here, a color-coded picture. Really handy for educational purposes because they've outlined the cover fat in yellow. They've marked in light blue where we're going to measure that back fat cover thickness. The red meat tissue is red, and then the marbling is white. And so it kind of makes it really clear. And you can see the same kind of thing in this other carcass over here on your right. They do kind of break it down here. You can see the marbling score. It's a small 50, would be a low choice carcass and comes out as a yield grade 2.4. Again, kind of with that yield grade comparison, the carcass on the right looks like it's a little bit smaller ribeye area, and it looks to have a little more fat cover in terms of that fat thickness at the 12th rib, and that proves true when we do the yield grade calculation. This is a yield grade 3.2 compared to the 2.4 on your left. So then the real nitty gritty of this is to think about how yield grade and quality grade affect carcass price when marketing on a grid. And so I, again, tend to probably oversimplify this. I think of it in terms of individual animals. And I'd like to break down for you kind of how that works. So basically, there'll be an offer as a base price paid for low choice yield grade 3 carcasses. Low choice yield grade 3 is considered kind of that minimum target for a high quality carcass. And then you're going to have premiums available for certified Angus beef and some other similar programs. So for CAB, for instance, you have to be in upper 2/3 choice. So you have to grade as average or high choice, and then meet several other requirements for different parameters. There's prime premiums, and then there's premiums for yield grade 1 and 2. And then there's discounts for select, standard, quality grades, and for yield grade 4 and 5. So basically, we look at that low choice yield grade 3 as kind of par or kind of average desirable carcass. And then if we do better than that in terms of quality grade or yield grade, we can get premiums. If we do worse than that, we can be appraised discounts. Now, there are a few other factors that come into play. One big one would be carcass weight. So right now, the current acceptable hot carcass weight is from 550 to about 1,100 pounds. The upper end of that acceptable range has increased gradually over time. There tend to be discounts for light and heavy carcasses. And if you can kind of hit that target of being 550 to 1,100, not necessarily a premium there, but it means you're eligible for that base price and any other available premiums. Maturity is a factor. So there are discounts that are applied to anything that seems to be over 30 months of age. They've got some different ways of analyzing that maturity, looking at degree of ossification of the vertebrae and looking at kind of the ossification and shape of the ribs, and even looking at the muscle texture a little bit. I think they could also look at dentition and look at the teeth to get some clues about age. And then lastly here, if you do a branded program like CAB, or, there are other breeds that have similar programs, Hereford, Limousine, I believe Charolais would all have their own version of branded carcass programs. They're going to have specific criteria beyond just yield grade and quality grade. So for instance, with CAB, hide color is a part of that. They want the cattle to be over 50% black. Ribeye area is a part of that. At one time, they had the maximum ribeye area as 16 square inches. I think they've actually increased that a little bit now, and in some cases will take up to 19. Back fat thickness, I think for CAB, they don't want over 1 inch of back fat. And so you've got to meet several other parameters there beyond just quality grade and yield grade to be eligible for those premiums. So this is an example of a price grid. This is very current. It's as of Monday, the 7th of April. There'd be a base price offered for low choice yield grade 3 carcasses that fall within the acceptable hot carcass weight range. And then premiums and discounts like I described earlier. And so if we walk through this point by point, quality grade is across the top row. And so there's a $30 prime premium right now. There's no premium or discount for choice carcasses, specifically low choice carcasses. There's a $20 discount for select. So we sometimes talk about that difference between low choice and select as the choice select spread. Discount for standards would be $45. Heiferettes here, and I'm not exactly sure how they define heiferette at this particular packing plant. But maybe females that have calved and lost a calf or something like that, but are still relatively young. Discount there is $50. And then other would be things like dark cutters, and the discount there is $55. Now, these discounts are in dollars per hundredweight of the hot carcass weight. Okay, so just as a quick example, if you had a hot carcass weight of 800 pounds and the calf graded prime, you're looking at an extra $240 income on that particular animal. Okay. Yield grade, we get premiums for yield grade 1 and 2, no premium or discount for yield grade 3, and then we get these discounts of $12 and $24 for 4s and 5s respectively. This row down here just talks about hot carcass weight. You'll notice that the discount for light carcasses is significantly more than the discount for heavy carcasses. So at least right now, they're telling us they would much rather have a carcass that's a little bit too heavy as opposed to too light. This is your CAB premium right now that's available through this packer. No real premium or discount for a Holstein or dairy influenced animal. And then if they do look to be too mature, there's a $12 per hundredweight discount. Now, the base price is obviously a big factor for producers and what your take home is. In terms of understanding how grid marketing works, the actual number of the base price really isn't that important, but it's super interesting right now. As we're recording this presentation in April of 2025, we're at record high cattle prices, and on this grid for this week, the base price is $335 per hundredweight of the hot carcass weight. So that's pretty incredible price. So just for fun and to illustrate some of what we've talked about here, I'm going back to the Iowa State Fair Beef of Merit Carcass Contest. And several years ago, we had an opportunity to get live pictures of the calves when they weighed in at the fair. And then from the packing plant, we got, and this was from Tyson, they were really cooperative and they allowed us to get ribeye pictures of each calf. And then we also got their full carcass data back. And so it really becomes a nice set of data where we've got live pictures, ribeye pictures, carcass measurements, yield grade, quality grade data. And I found it to be kind of useful just for some educational programs like this. So we talked about this steer already, powerful lean steer, probably kind of yield grade 1, yield grade 2 kind of a calf based on our earlier discussion. And so these are his ribeye pictures. Now the fat cover here is a little misleading. I think it may have to do with the angle of the camera. The fat thickness is often measured a little greater than it actually looks on these pictures. So I'm just giving you a heads up on that. To me, when we look at these ribeyes, he looks relatively lean in terms of fat cover, but seems to have pretty good marbling considering he's not overly finished, right? And so these are his measurements. So 0.34 inches of back fat. Carcass weight was 782 pounds. Ribeye area was 15.2 inches, 15.2 square inches. That all calculates to a yield grade of 1.97. Now, something that's kind of interesting, we all learned in elementary school that when we're dealing with a decimal, we look at that last decimal number, and if it's 5 or greater, we would round up, right? They don't do that with these yield grades. If they convert this just to a whole number yield grade, they simply cut off the decimal point and everything to the right of it. And this calf was actually paid as a yield grade 1. He did go ahead and grade, grade low choice. And so graded pretty well considering he was a yield grade 1 and kind of lean overall. He's the kind of calf that if he would have had a few more days on feed, he probably would have laid down some more fat cover and some more marbling, and could have bumped up that quality grade some. So this is a very different calf in terms of his phenotype. Big framey calf, narrower build, less thickness in the hind quarter, less thickness through the top. But like I said, a pretty big framed, rangy kind of calf. You think there should be plenty of product there. But I found him to be a little misleading. When I looked at him live, I didn't think that he would be quite this fat. Hopefully you can appreciate their pretty significant fat cover. Now he also has significant marbling, making these ribeyes look very, very high quality. But if we take a look at his numbers, he has almost an inch of back fat, basically a 900-pound hot carcass weight. For that carcass weight, a pretty small ribeye area at just 11.3 square inches. So when you do the math, he has a calculated yield grade of 5.10. Okay, so he is at risk of being discounted just for being a yield grade 5. The other big problem here is that, yes, he produces a really high quality steak and he grades prime, which is fantastic. On some of these grids, including this one that was used for this contest, if a calf is graded as a yield grade 5, then he's not eligible to get the prime premium or the CAB premium. So fantastic that we got him to prime, but we've got enough fat cover compared to muscle mass that this yield grade 5 designation kind of takes away our premiums. This is an Angus calf from that show. That very nice looking calf from the profile, from the hind perspective. Doesn't look like anything super special, not tremendously wide or thick, laying down just a little fat cover around the tail head, but nothing too significant. But these are his ribeyes. And I hope you can appreciate here a pretty impressive amount of marbling and a pretty just moderate amount of fat cover. Okay. And so that tells me this calf probably has some pretty good genetics for carcass merit and marbling potential. Um, he was right in there at a pretty average back fat, pretty average numbers, yield grade 3.38, but enough marbling to grade prime. So he would have gone ahead and received that prime premium at the time. And then our last calf here, just for comparison's sake, it's a big limousine calf. Super high cutability, super high performance, big ribeye, muscular hind quarter, but looks pretty lean in his live pictures, and that proves to be true when we look at his ribeye pictures. Minimal fat cover and minimal marbling. And so if we look at his numbers, and actually I say minimal fat cover, his fat cover is actually comparable to a couple calves we saw earlier with better marbling. And so you might say, well, his genetics maybe aren't built for deposition of intramuscular fat. He certainly could have used more time on feed as well, but he actually graded a low select and was a yield grade 1. In this case, he would have received a yield grade 1 premium, but he would have been paid at that select price. So he would have gotten the, probably at the time was $20 some a hundredweight discount for being select as opposed to choice. If he would have had even a touch less marbling and graded standard, they would have taken away the yield grade premium. And so kind of speaks to the importance of knowing the terms and conditions of your marketing grid. So hopefully you enjoyed taking a look at those. I think they're just super interesting for discussion's sake. Couple slides here to kind of summarize things, and then we'll open it up for questions. I think when you think about marketing on a grid, there's potential for significant premiums, but there's also potential for significant discounts. And I think that raises the question then, how well do you know your cattle? Do you have any history of collecting carcass data or ultrasound data? Have you selected for carcass merit? What bulls are you using or buying? Maybe even, what's the breed composition or the hide color of your cattle? If you're feeding out yourself, you also have to think about how good are you at feeding cattle for performance and carcass quality, because genetics are a huge part of this, but feeding and management are another huge part. And that really does come into play. And the other thing here is, how good are you at determining when cattle are finished? When we market them and kind of how finished they are at marketing can have a big impact on those yield grade numbers and quality grade designations. Now, we may argue that that's somewhat out of our control, because in my experience, often we call the cattle buyer out to look at them, and even when we think they're finished, they'll say give them another 30 to 45 days. But I think it always behooves us to be well informed and to be capable of kind of looking at those things critically. And if we can have some sense ourselves of when the cattle are ready for market, I think that can be helpful. I would finish here with just a slide kind of describing to do your homework. So not all grids are the same. I saw it printed somewhere that no grid is ideal for all types of cattle, and no cattle are ideal for all grids. And that makes sense. So you need to get to know your cattle and find a grid that is a good fit for them. If you're targeting a specific grid, you may have to select, breed, and feed with that specific goal in mind. And that may be a long-term project. When you think about the long life cycle of a beef cattle herd, to make significant changes takes time. It's doable, especially with the EPDs and tools like that we have nowadays, but it can take some time. And then lastly here, just learn well those grid terms and conditions so that you can make informed decisions, and so that you know what to expect, kind of minimize surprises when you get your results and your checks. I always end here with my contact information. Best way to get me is by email or by my cell phone number here. always happy to take questions and happy to help with various different consulting things, and feel free to give me a call or an email if you'd like. So I'm going to turn it over to Ann here, I think, and she's maybe moderating if we have any questions coming in.
Yeah, I'm back. You did it. That was great. I have lots of questions. The best part about moderating is that I get to ask my questions first. Um, Now, folks online, if you want to type in your questions, we will get to those. I will set my questions aside, but I do have some to get us started because this has such an economic impact, and maybe it's not something that we all are experts on, right? In the grading, and so I found it really fascinating. So thank you. And I am curious, the electronic scan. I'm curious your thoughts on, is most grading done by a person, or is it done by an AI machine? Like, are we moving more toward that? And would that be more consistent then?
Yeah, that's a good question. So historically, the grading was done by USDA graders, and it was all done by hand. And I was always shocked at their ability to keep up the line speed. I don't know exactly how they did the ribeye area, um, but those graders got extremely good, just very proficient at it. Um, Obviously, if it's a human-driven thing, like humans make mistakes, right? Humans have biases, so you know there was always potential for little inconsistencies here and there. I do think we've moved, I wouldn't say to the point of using AI, but I guess I don't know all the algorithms that are behind the scenes in those computers. But um, I think we have gone at the major packers to predominantly using digital camera data. And I would think with a quick flash of the camera, not only do you get the picture, but you probably very quickly get ribeye area, cover fat, thickness, and it plugs right into the equation for yield grade and stuff. So, um, and in the same way with marbling, it's probably looking at right there, um, kind of the ratio of marbling to red meat. And I think it probably has improved consistency. I think there are some differences too. I think maybe we saw a little bit of an increase with the higher quality grades when we made the switch to cameras here a few years ago. But I think it's probably 3 or 4 years plus now that we've been doing predominantly camera grading.
Question that came in was, in the course of history, why was the ribeye chosen as kind of the grading factor?
Oh, that's a good question, and I don't know if I really have a good answer for that. There is some debate still today about whether the system that was chosen is the best system. um, and certainly as our cattle have changed over time, that debate grows and grows. And do we need to alter our equation for yield grade and stuff like that? I can't tell you exactly how and why it's the ribeye and why it's the spot between the 12th and 13th rib. But I think this goes back clear to the 1960s, maybe. And there were some studies done. I've heard one guy, a meat scientist from down in Texas, I've heard him talk about the fact that the studies that were done to create that system did not have a very large number of cattle in them, which he was kind of describing that that's a bad thing. Like we could have done better in terms of having more cattle in those studies. But on the other hand, I think it's kind of proved relatively true over time. Like it kind of works. That ribeye is, you know, at least an estimation. I know it's looking at one specific muscle, but it's at least an estimation of how muscular the animal is. And then we picked one specific spot, but looking at fat thickness right there kind of gives us some estimation of how fat the animal is. But I would have to do a little digging to find exactly how and why that developed that way.
but the best part was that we can follow up, and if we do find something, I can include that in the follow-up messages maybe tomorrow.
Okay.
And so I am curious, okay, if you send a load to a packer, do they grade a certain number on that truck or your contract, or is it how does that do they average them together? I'm curious, like what is that, and does it vary by packer?
So I think it would vary by packer, and it probably would vary by the grid. Um, I think most of the time, and I will admit, I tend to think about this very individually because I tend to work more with 4-H and FFA, and a lot of my carcass experience is looking at reports of individual animals in small groups like that. But I think for a load of cattle, they can still do individual carcass grading for all the animals, and then you're going to get a report that kind of more summarizes the average, like you said.
Okay.
You might not get each individual result correlated with a tag number, but you're going to get some average for your load, how many graded choice, how many graded prime, how many were yield grade, whatever. The other interesting thing is that sometimes in those terms and conditions of a grid, you have to meet kind of a minimum. Typically, it's minimum of low choice to actually even be eligible to get that base price consistently across the group. So, for instance, they may say you need to get at least 50% choice to kind of meet that minimum standard. And if you don't, you're at risk of actually losing out on some money even below that base market price. Sometimes they'll do it based on plant averages, so it's kind of a moving thing week to week. But you may have to try to kind of hit that target of at least the certain percentage of carcass choice carcasses as compared to the plant had last week.
These are good questions. And so next one kind of goes back to your, the individual animals. So as someone who markets fat cattle direct to consumers, which a lot of, right, we have a lot of that. And
Mm-hmm.
so the cattle end up at the local locker that doesn't grade as an option. And so do you know kind of across the state, are there meat lockers that provide grading, or is that kind of back to, can you um, as the marketer, right, of that animal, provide kind of your own judgment of its grade? I don't know.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Um, so I don't know that local lockers are really going to provide that service to grade them. Most probably won't want to take the time to do that. Many will not have someone there with the expertise to do that. Now, depending on the locker that you use, some of them do have USDA inspectors in and out of there pretty frequently, or state inspectors in and out of there pretty frequently. But again, I don't know that they're really in there to actually grade carcasses, but more just to oversee the process, right, and make sure that things are done properly. Um, I don't know. There may be people with the state, Animal Industry Bureau or with the USDA that could do that. I try to think about somebody like myself, not in any way like on the same level as a USDA grader, but I do a few carcasses now and then. Is there some way we could set up a fee for service to do that for you?
Oh, wheels are turning now, Chris. You're like,
Yeah,
that sounds
yeah.
fun, right?
Uh, Certainly, you could learn to do it. Um, it would be a pretty unofficial thing, right? Because you've got a
Right.
vested interest in what those results are. So, but if you wanted to be able to just describe like what you saw to your customers, um, I think there's maybe merit in just learning yourself to do it, and seeing if the locker will let you kind of look at those carcasses.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think that that's very true. It's like these pictures you show to be able to show your product. Next, like those USDA judgment, like those, that's a standard card. And so to be able to
Yeah.
build that in, like that is definitely a benefit to those direct marketed um, producers. So yes. Okay, we are coming right up on time. And so these were great questions. And I again, Chris, thank you so much for joining us because I have 2 pages of notes, folks. That it was just like these are things that I've been around but not been taught. And so for that, I very much appreciate this being part of our series on cattle marketing and how to improve it. Like I hope all of you did as well. So Chris, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
I think the thing that I would leave people with is just to really put a lot of thought into it. I think every now and then we get into to ruts where we market a certain way because that's the way we've always done it, or because that's the way Dad did it or Grandpa did it. Um, I know years ago there was a specialist in Southwest Iowa that had done a lot of work on retain ownership and commented on, many times there was some dividends to be paid through retained ownership. But there's also some risk. And so I would just encourage people to put a lot of thought and maybe some math into deciding how they want to market their cattle.
Okay. So that's a great note to end on. I thank you all again for joining us. We are back with our last session tomorrow with Joseph Lensing, our farm management specialist in Northwest or Northeast Iowa, and going to talk through some marketing strategies. I think maybe some LRP coverage that's going to be our subject matter for tomorrow. And so again, you'll get this replay. Again, if you want to share it with folks, absolutely rewatch. There's a couple things I think I want to go back and hear you talk about again. And so with that, we're going to close out the session and have a great day.
Thank you very much.